My name is Keith Bredge. I'm the Hong Kong Bureau Chief for the New York Times, and I'll be your host tonight on behalf of the Foreign Correspondents Club Board of Governors. I'd like to introduce, as though he needs it, Mike Chinoy. We have done many of this series. Who here has not been to a previous installment of his series? Anybody? Okay, we have a handful of hands here. Mike Chinoy is doing a superb, lengthy series chronicling American foreign correspondence in China from the Chinese Civil War all the way up to the present. Tonight, you will get 2002 and 2008, the coverage of events like the Sichuan earthquake, the Tibetan uprising, the Charter 08. Some of these events that may have, with hindsight, have represented a peak in what now may have been Chinese liberalism under Hu Jintao before the tightening began. For those of you who want to start marking your calendars for the next one, that will be on May 19th, and that will be covering the period of 2009 to 2012. For those of you who are particularly fond of what you see tonight, also you can support his program by going on the USC website, and you'll get more details there on how USC is trying to work on China-US relations. And with that, Mike Chinoy. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith. It's pretty amazing to me that there are really literally only a half dozen people here who have not yet been to one of these. I think this must be at least the 9th or 10th, maybe. And I'm pleased to announce that this project is actually completed now. There are 12 episodes altogether, and this is the 10th of them, I guess. It's called Tremors, and it looks at the period 2007-2008, which was a very important watershed moment in China, particularly because of the Olympics, which were really kind of a key moment in terms of China taking its place on the international stage. But they were also very important because in the run-up to the Olympics, as part of commitments that the Chinese government had made to the International Olympic Committee, conditions for journalists were liberalized very significantly, and many of the restrictions that foreign correspondents had labored under in preceding years were lifted. And so in theory, it became much easier to report on China during this time, and in certain very important ways, it was easier. But in certain very important ways, it turned out not to be that much easier, and there were a lot of tensions and conflicts that were generated as reporters tried to test the limits. So that's what this film is about. For the half dozen of you who are new to this project, let me just briefly explain. Assignment China is, as I mentioned, a 12-part documentary film series that we've done at the U.S.-China Institute at the University of Southern California that chronicles the story of the American journalists who covered China beginning in the mid-1940s during the Chinese Civil War all the way up to the present day. And the premise behind it is basically that the way in which the American press has covered China over all these years has really had a huge impact on how people, not only in the States, but given the clout of the American news media, people all over the world have understood or misunderstood China. And yet, unless you're in the news business or know somebody who is, for most people really have very little sense of what it was like to cover China and who the people were who were involved in this kind of work. And so we thought it would be very interesting to try, in effect, to tell the story of the people who have told the China story over all these years. These films were designed largely for educational use in China studies and journalism education programs, but they're all available on the U.S.-China Institute website. They will be available before long as a thumb drive, where it'll be possible to purchase all of them, all 12, and watch them. And we're exploring other ways to make use of this treasure trove of material that we hope will provide a kind of lasting history. For people like myself who spent many years as a journalist, I think it's really important to give people today an understanding of what it was like during the many years before now, and the kinds of challenges that people face making sense of China particularly given how important the China story has been and given how it has become increasingly important today. So with that, if we can turn the lights off, we'll get started on the film. It runs just 40, I think about 45 minutes. It's not as long as some of the others, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards.
To what extent do you think that they were slow in deciding what their policy would be on the Sichuan quake, so therefore they allowed unrestricted access for Beijing and Shanghai correspondents because that was what they'd previously planned as part of the allowing open coverage for the Olympics, but they could not immediately adjust on Hong Kong-based correspondents because there was no prior plan?
I mean, I don't know, obviously, but my guess is that this was a catastrophe of such immense magnitude that they were just overwhelmed. And I think that the normal functioning of the system was kind of suspended, paralyzed. And therefore, I don't think that anybody made a conscious decision in that moment. I think it happened. It was so huge. The government had tens of thousands of people killed and hundreds of thousands of injured and whole cities destroyed. And it was 4 months before the Olympics. And all their focus was on that. And so a few dozen reporters who got on planes and cars and went there, they just slipped through. I suspect in Hong Kong there was administrative decisions would have had to been made about issuing visas, and I think they were just utterly overwhelmed. And it's just, it's interesting, you know, the Chinese, I mean, you have lots of Chinese officials and others who complain about the foreign press and how biased the foreign press are. But it's very interesting to me that the moment that so many journalists look back on this absolutely horrible sequence of events as a high point of good feeling about China. And it does raise an interesting question. If they were not so thuggish in their treatment of the press, they would get much better and more sympathetic and fair-minded coverage. But if you keep treating people badly all the time, you're going to exacerbate all the tendencies that exist anyway in the media to be cynical and all the rest of it. Just one other point about the earthquake, which resonated with me, because I was a kind of cub reporter in Hong Kong in 1976. It was my first year trying to be a journalist. I was radio reporter for CBS News when the Tangshan earthquake happened. And I remember that there were, I think, there was a AFP and a Reuters bureau, and I'm not sure whether there was a Toronto Globe and Mail correspondent in Beijing at the time, but no Americans for sure. You couldn't go there. And we were literally reduced to going to the terminus of the train station in Jimsa and looking for people coming off the train from China and saying, the odd, you know, European or African business person, did you happen to be in Beijing? You didn't happen to have a home movie camera with a roll of film. And that was as close as you, and of course nobody did. And that was as close as you could get, which was essentially nothing, almost nothing on Beijing and absolutely nothing at the time on Tangshan. So to me, in that intervening, whatever it was, 40 years, the fact that it could go from that to NPR being able to essentially broadcast almost within moments of a disaster of this magnitude does say something about how China, for all of the problems, which are very real, and there are worrying indications they're going backwards in many ways now, but how much it had opened up to the journalists when you look at the mid-'70s as the point of departure. And that always resonated with me because I was the one that had to go wait hour and hour train station with no luck in 76.
You mentioned James Miles in Tibet, and I was living in Beijing at the time, and it seemed like that his ability to report for, I can't remember how many days he was there, but for those of us living in Beijing, we're really surprised that he had an open mic for as long as he did. And I'm wondering, from the perspective outside of those of us who were sort of confined to what Beijing allowed to us, that seemed to be an opening up that really surprised us. And could you comment on that?
Well, again, I don't know all the details of that trip, but he was there on a pre-planned trip of so many days, and the Chinese bureaucracy is not known for its suppleness and dexterity. So if he had a 6-day trip and it was day 3 in the evening when this happened, he's going to get his 6-day trip because that's the way the system tends to work. I think one of the things that's interesting is his coverage, from what I remember of it, was pretty balanced. And it's yet another example of where if the Chinese would allow greater access, they would actually get more of what they like rather than denying the access and then complaining about the negative coverage. And in the next episode of the series, which I guess we're going to show in May, one of the things that we look at is the coverage of the Urumqi riots in 2009, where they did have a quite different approach to the press. Unlike Lhasa, where they didn't let anybody in, and once Miles left, that was it. In Urumqi, they did let people in. They actually set up a press center. They escorted journalists around town, thinking that this would be a way to get more balanced coverage. And to some degree, it worked, although, as you'll see if you come watch the movie, that it had a predictably unhappy ending. But it is, and they have not since replicated that. But it is interesting that they seem to have drawn some conclusions from Tibet that they should actually try the next time something like that happened to be more open, and they did in that one occasion.
Up here, please. Let's wait a moment for the microphone. I'm sorry.
Hi, if we fast forward to 2016, has much changed or have we regressed?
I think overall things are regressing in the sense that the overall climate in China is regressing. It's much darker, the controls are much tighter. Journalists are still doing a lot of good work, they're still traveling around, but I think that the pressures on them, the suspicion towards them is greater. I mean, I think it's been a kind of slow but steady downward spiral since 2008. I think Keith's observation at the beginning is really spot on, that this was kind of the high point of the government saying we are, as a matter of policy, going to be more open and broad-minded about the press. And it's been shrinking ever since, but because nobody will physically stop you from getting on a plane or a train, and it's a big country, and there's a lot of information out there in ways that certainly weren't true when I lived in Beijing in the 80s and 90s. You're still getting some very, very good journalism, and including a lot of stuff about topics that the government doesn't like. But I think it's overall the attitudes are hardening. I guess I would put it that way. I don't mean whether anybody here who's in the news world who's got colleagues in Beijing or what you hear from your colleagues.
I think I would draw a distinction that they will physically stop you from getting on that plane if you're a Hong Kong-based foreign correspondent. So the rules in that regard have changed dramatically in the last several years. So it used to be, that has significantly narrowed the pool of people who can get on that plane to those who are accredited to Beijing, Shanghai, or possibly Guangzhou, but not, it's much, much more difficult on the Hong Kong side of that.
And I think for the people in China, that these tendencies that were evident even in 2008, that no one will stop somebody who's based in Beijing or Shanghai from getting on a plane, but you go to a town or a village, and whatever the rule book may say, the local authorities and their hired goons will more often than not give you a hard time or give a hard time to people you talk to. And I think in this current climate in China, which is just generally, I think, much more repressive and oppressive really than at any time since the immediate aftermath of Tiananmen, I think my sense is that makes it harder to talk to people. Certainly people who might have critical things to say about what's going on.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on to whom you're speaking. Who next?
Hi.
Please.
Can you talk a little bit about your next projects?
About my next project. I'm barely out from under this project. My next project, I hope, is to turn the hundreds and hundreds of pages of transcripts we have of Assignment China into a book. So check back in about 3 years.
Kin Ming.
Thank you. Have you received any official feedback over any of the episodes you have done?
I've had no feedback whatsoever. I know that officially. The earlier episodes that cover topics that are less sensitive in China because they're either a long, long time ago, or they deal with issues like the Nixon trip or the early days of Deng's reforms that are looked on in a more benign way. I've shown in China. I've shown 2 or 3 of these different episodes at universities in Beijing and Shanghai and Sichuan and Guangzhou, and I think the China Daily and CCTV did very positive write-ups about that. The more recent stuff, I haven't had any feedback. It's not hard to predict what they would think of it, but that, you know, that's what was in the news, and that's what the journalists covered. So that's as Deng Xiaoping said, seek truth from facts. I mean, that's what the journalists thought was important, and so that's what we asked them about. But I've not had any feedback. But I certainly would think it would be very unlikely to be able to show any of the more recent films in China.
Yes, please.
Not directly related to the film, do you think the disappearing booksellers was planned or it was a cock-up?
Well, I mean, as a general principle, I'm a great believer in the cock-up theory of international relations. It makes much more sense to me than most other international relations theories. I honestly don't know. And so you're really engaging in speculation here. I mean, did Xi Jinping order it? I kind of think he's got bigger things to worry about. Are there people at some levels in the system who found the sort of scurrilous, scandal-mongering books about Xi Jinping's love life offensive and you know, undermining the narrative about Xi Jinping that they're trying to build, either contracting out to, who knows, triads here? I mean, totally possible. I have no way to judge. I do think that this is the scare. I think my sense is that this has scared people in Hong Kong in a way that nothing else since the handover has frightened them, and I think it's really freaked a lot of people out here.
It's very bad to have done it just before the Taiwanese elections.
Well, that assumed.
They got what they asked for, didn't they?
Well, yes and no, but I mean, there's a bigger question about that, which is that if Hong Kong was supposed to be the model, I mean, the original idea of one country, 2 systems was to entice Taiwan to come back. So you would think, logically, from the beginning, that if they wanted people in Taiwan who were dubious to start with, to look at Hong Kong and say, gee, this really isn't that bad, you could have a very long list of things they would have done differently. So whether that means that they have a different calculation on Taiwan, or whether that means they see Hong Kong with a set of problems that don't allow them to do this, or whether it's like our way or the highway and that's just the way we think and the hell with it, I don't know. But there are so many points where if they really wanted to appeal to Taiwan, they would have gone in a different direction in their management of Hong Kong than they've done.
Okay, there's one more.
Mike, can you talk, now that you've completed the series, can you sort of give us your perspective about the current crackdown that we're seeing under Xi Jinping? Because it seems to me that over the last 30 years, you haven't always seen journalists, academics, human rights activists, lawyers, etc., all crack down on it at the same time. It fluctuates. Like in the Beijing Olympics, you know, journalists were given a little bit more of a free ride, but others were repressed. Where do you think this is coming from? What's happening now? Is there any historical precedent that you can draw from what you've seen?
It's a very good question, and like everything with China, it's, you know, you're making at best educated or semi-educated guesses. I mean, you know, when Xi Jinping took over and this kind of started, there was a school of thought that if you look back at the period from the late 70s, that you get these swings that, you know, and we've chronicled a lot of them in this film. You have Democracy Wall, and then you have the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, and then you have the student protests of '86, and then you have the anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign, then you have Tiananmen, then you have the crackdown after Tiananmen, then you have the revival of economic reform. So it's gone like this. And there was a school of thought that said that, well, this is that what you're seeing from Xi Jinping is just another one of these lurches. And was it you, Ted, who had the phrase signaling left to turn right? We were talking about, is he making these moves in order to batten down the hatches because the ship of state is going to go through stormy waters to do these reforms? But I think my own feeling now is that I don't think that doesn't work for me, because I think Xi Jinping is qualitatively different now, that this is not just a lurch from greater openness to greater tightening, which will at some point unwind, and I think he has got a clear agenda that ideology, reimposition of very strong ideological controls and re-centralization of party authority over as many aspects of life in China as it can manage to do is absolutely central, both for his own political survival and, in his view, for the survival of the party as the vehicle to lead the country. And so we are seeing, I think, kind of unprecedented, certainly since the aftermath of Tiananmen, across the board tightening and the media, in academia, in public discussion, NGO, not just the usual dissidents, but and it's coupled with this very sweeping anti-corruption campaign, which on the one hand is clearly needed because corruption is endemic in the Chinese system, but this is being done in a way that raises a lot of questions about the extent to which it's a vehicle to get rid of people who Xi Jinping sees as not on his side, and there's also, it's created, my sense is, it's created a sort of tremendous sense of fear in the system, and you hear these anecdotal accounts of decisions don't get made, people are afraid to do anything, everybody's hiding under the table, nobody wants to be the nail that stands up, and that has the potential over time to be sort of like throwing sand into the gears of the system. So I think it's different. I mean, some of the stuff, the new East is Red song there was a piece about yesterday, the cult around Xi Jinping, and I think this is coming at the expense of the economy. I think the ideological controls are more important than the economy. And what I wonder about is how long they can assume that the economy, the China powerhouse that we've seen in the last 25, 30 years is going to continue if you start mucking with some of the key ingredients. Foreign companies are getting nervous, if people are afraid to make decisions, if contact with the West is becoming harder, if Chinese experts and scholars and so on can't easily access what's being discussed internationally on the internet, if ideological controls are being imposed in universities, if everybody's running scared, over time, what's that going to do, particularly given the degree to which he, even though he's clearly sort of in charge at the moment, he's antagonized a lot of different powerful interest groups, and I think a lot of them are just kind of sitting there biding their time, and arrogating so much power to him means he's also responsible if it doesn't go right, and as we saw with the stock market and the evaluation of the currency, things can screw up. So I think it's kind of surface very tight, but very uncertain and potentially fraught underneath. But how it's going to play out, I mean, I've been watching China long enough to know I don't have the slightest idea.
Very good answer.
You also mentioned, when you were in 76, you're trying to get footage and trying to talk to people if they had anything. I imagine today it's a lot easier.
Well, I should say, I left CNN 10 years ago, so I don't do this now for a living, thankfully. But, the focus in the series is on American journalists, because I work for the U.S.-China Institute, and also we had to have some limits because otherwise it's just too complicated. Melissa Chan, both being an American and, as you'll see in the next, she was subsequently expelled from China. Her visa was denied, and so she became a kind of major media cause. So that's one of the main reasons why she's portrayed. I mean, last fall, a French journalist was kicked out, or had her visa not renewed after she wrote a commentary about Xinjiang that contradicted the official Chinese narrative. So the American press carries a lot of weight. I mean, a place like the New York Times or the networks. But that doesn't mean that the Chinese authorities will happily go after people regardless of their origins if they cross certain lines or touch certain sensitive nerves. And in terms of your second question, I mean, the internet exists in China, and video-enabled smartphones exist in China, and that's a source of material which the government struggles mightily to try and control. But you know, it's like an endless race between the government and the technology, and the government gets ahead, and the technology comes up. So it's much harder to keep things under wraps in the way that it was when I first started in the 70s, because there are so many people, and even with censorship and so on, this material exists, and anybody who's got a phone that has camera can record it, and it tends to make its way out. So that's a resource that exists now in a way that didn't before.
To what extent do you think the relationship between the press and the Chinese government is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy? I mean, hatred is something that's usually learned. And it seems that they really dislike each other, and then each side confirms the other's reason for disliking them. And it seems to be spiraling into this sort of vicious circle that often, as news is reported, doesn't seem to really represent everything that's going on in China. You know, the Chinese have this saying, you know, 井底之蛙, you know, like the frog looking at the sky from the bottom of a well. And, you know, the sky is blue or the sky is gray. I wonder to what extent the foreign press, the American press in particular, is a frog at the bottom of a well.
It's a really interesting question, and when you know, if you were to sit down and watch all of these films in one go, which I don't think I would recommend unless you're really bored or on like a 17-hour plane flight, this pattern just of the press pushing to try and go to more places, get more access, talk to more people, and the government stopping them, is repeated over and over and over. I mean, it's the most enduring theme, whether it's people going in the very few people who got to go in the 60s, or the press on the Nixon trip, or the first people who opened bureaus. So, you know, journalists want to go and want to be able to make their own decisions about who they talk to. And the system wants to control what they do, because that's what a communist system does. They control the press and the narrative. But that's not what Western journalists do, and it's not the tradition that Western journalists come from. So there is this built-in conflict. And it's very tough. If you're treated like a spy and hassled and followed and intimidated and so on, you're not going to, it's going to be harder to go out of your way to bend over backwards to try and, you know, give the government the benefit of the doubt. I also think that a lot of times there are, you know, the system gets in the way of stories. The paranoia in the system and the impulse towards control prevents stories that would be more positive from coming out, because this is a system where you're a mid-level official dealing with a journalist in a town or in a province or something. You don't know whether. All you know is that if you let a journalist go to a certain place and ask a question about a potentially more sensitive topic, you might end up with a really nuanced story that portrays this issue very sympathetically, and people come away saying, gosh, China's really got tough problems. There's serious people trying to do, you know, the right thing under difficult circumstances. They seem to be making some headway. But you don't know whether up the chain some official gets their nose out of joint, because in that story, the journalist also quoted somebody who was critical, and suddenly there's your career. So there's no incentive in the Chinese system for any official at any level to take any risk with a reporter. It's just not worth it if you're interested in saving your job, let alone advancing. So, and there's not a degree, I mean, if you look at all the conspiracy theories that exist, broad, in many areas in China, and I'm sure at high levels too, when they look at the coverage and they see agendas and controls, because that's how it works in China. So they are mutually reinforcing. I would say that the vast majority of foreign journalists would come in with an open mind, try to do I think that Melissa Chan's anecdote about her first big story is classic. Great little human interest feature. This phenomenon in China. People go from the countryside to the eastern coastal areas to work in the factories. So here you got a 12-year-old kid. Parents are making money to send back to the village. Kid's living on her own. It's a human interest story. And the fact that she did that, thinking exactly that, and she got into trouble, she got detained by the local authorities, she got yelled at by the foreign ministry. What's the takeaway from that? Other than this system is awful and these people don't get it. And so, and that reinforced that over many, many years on topics great and small, and now you get into this situation, and it's hard. I don't think there's an easy solution, but I think there are lots of things that are going on in China that would give a more nuanced view if journalists could more easily get to them without being hassled on so many levels. Would be a good thing, but they can't more often than not because they're hassled, and as a result, this just feeds on itself.
Okay, two last quick questions. If you can ask both of them together, please, and get them both in here.
Just quickly, you talk about this period of the 2008 as this great opening and the high point. And you kind of hinted that there were some events in 2008 of the way the coverage turned that made them shut down. But was there a bookend event that kind of shut down the opening, or was it just kind of a gradual erosion?
It's a process. It's a process. It's not a. I mean, I would say that the Arab Spring and the completely illusory fear of the so-called Jasmine Revolution in China in the winter of 2011. If there is a sort of bookend event, that was the one of them, because that just fed every anxiety in the Chinese system, and they decided at that point, they were so nervous, even though it was never going to be a Jasmine Revolution in China for lots of reasons. Many of them positive. China's situation was a lot better. I mean, I'd much rather be a young, 22-year-old in China in 2011 than in Cairo. But the result was that they mounted this very aggressive move to intimidate the press, including knocking on people's homes at doors at 5 o'clock in the morning, threatening them with expulsion if they went to look into these things, and all kinds of very, very nasty stuff. So I think that was the moment that just fed this Chinese anxiety, and then it was exacerbated in 2012, both by the combination of the impending leadership transition, just when David Barboza of the Times did his amazing reporting about the hidden wealth of Wen Jiabao's family, and Mike Forsyth then of Bloomberg did the same thing about Xi Jinping's family. And the final episode of the series, which is called Follow the Money, which I hope will show over the summer, is essentially the sort of untold backstory of how that happened. But I think the Jasmine Revolution, if you had to identify a single moment when they just decided, we got to beat these people down because we're too scared, that would be it.
Just quickly, I wanted to push back on the previous exchange, although what you just said about Jasmine Revolution and then the Bloomberg and New York Times stories, I think was absolutely right. The one area in which you could say, if anything, you could criticize the Western press for being extremely positive on China is actually business reporting until that time of the corruption stories, I would say. I mean, many people think, in fact, that the business press, generally speaking, gave China, very, very positive coverage. 5-year plans, they're working, China's growing, rest of, more than 10% a year, nobody else is, yada, yada, yada. So just to hear you guys talk about, the press and China are always at war and the Western press is always negative on China, I think that's not quite true. I think that, if you're writing about the Falun Gong or human rights protesters, definitely that's right. But if you're, there were some that I would say that the press in the West is actually maybe too positive on.
It's an interesting point. And, no, I mean, not, you know, it's extremely, the press, it's very hard to generalize. And for every article that's negative, you can go and find an article about some new Chinese millionaire or some new Chinese tech company or whatever. So, I mean, the reality is China is, even now, multiple shades of gray more than black and white. But this is a government and a system that doesn't like shades of gray. It has its own narrative and it imposes it on the Chinese media. And I think as China has gotten more powerful and more convinced of its own power, and as it's watched the problems in the West in the wake of the financial crisis in 08 and 09, I think this kind of gave them greater impetus to the notion that we now can impose our narrative on the Western press as well, and we can impose it on any discussion, study, analysis of China, and you see that increasingly in many ways, that China is trying to throw its weight around and ensure that only its version of events or its way of looking at things is given prominence, and they push back very hard at alternative views.